Of course, there is corruption in Ukraine. This is what Zelensky keeps saying. We want EU to do something for us. We want the deadline for the EU accession in 2027. And at the same time, nothing was done to rebuild trust. He brought this parliament through elections with his promises to deliver justice and fight corruption. The Ukrainian people will deal with parliament.
That sounds like a threat. Ms. Kaleniuk, thank you again for joining us. We spoke with you the last time was 4 months ago, and our main topic of discussion was the corruption scandal that engulfed Ukraine back in the fall. 4 months passed. Mr. Yermak, who was the chief of staff of President Zelensky, resigned. We also know that the mastermind behind this whole operation, Mr. Timur Mindic, has escaped to Israel. Currently, we know that the former energy minister and Justice Minister, Mr. Halushenko, was charged in this case. Can you give us a short recap what happened in the 4 months that has passed? And are you confident that this case will actually move to trial and that people who are responsible for this will get proper justice?
Quick recap. Let's highlight the most important events which did happen or did not happen. Number one, Andriy Yermak, chief of staff of President Zelensky, promised to the entire world that he is going to the front line to defend his own country. Everybody was looking where he is. Mikhailo Tkach, investigative journalist from Ukrainska Pravda, made even investigation and revealed that he is not in the front line, but is still somewhere in Kyiv at different negotiations with still current officials deciding some stuff. We don't know which stuff. And just recently, Andriy Yermak appeared to be he appeared to have his new job in the Association of Lawyers. Basically, it's Bar Association of Ukraine. So he will be in charge of defending, coordinating other lawyers how to defend Ukrainians who are suffering from large-scale war. So it's first track. Unfortunately, no charges from NABU and SAPO, from anti-corruption bodies regarding Andriy Yermak.
Do you know why this is happening? Because Mr. Yermak is believed to be the most important person in this investigation.
He is probably the most powerful person in this investigation, and all the large-scale corruption scheme worth of $100 million could not happen without him knowing and supporting it. So it's a good question, and I would recommend you to ask this question to Mr. Krivanos, the head of NABU, and Mr. Klemenko, the head of SAPO.
Well, we actually did, and we spoke with the president on this and with heads of anti-corruption institutions, and all of them are saying that there's no agreement that Mr. Yermak is not going to be charged, is that there's no enough evidence to charge Yermak, despite the fact that he resigned after there were searches in his office. So a lot of people in Ukraine think that if this person is not going to be charged, then Ukraine still doesn't have a healthy justice system.
I agree. I think Yermak is going to be a very important test for NABU and SAPO. They have started the job. They have conducted the search. They have said A, they have to say B. Basically, that's it. And this is what maintains trust of the people of Ukraine to NABU and SAPO. If they are able to go against untouchable people, which they have started in November, the trust will maintain and the people of Ukraine will be protecting them. Because the attacks on NABU and SAPO, they do continue. They are not in that obvious form like it did happen during summer when a separate law was voted in one day to destroy their independence. However, some intelligence agencies are wiretapping the NABU detectives who are investigating, for example, defense sector. We see that those people who were main masterminds of attack against NABU and SAPO, they are still at their positions, like Prosecutor General Ruslan Kravchenko, like the head of the State Bureau of Investigations, Oleksiy Sukhachov. President is completely fine with that. He And it's number two thing, which did not happen. President, on one hand, promised to reboot State Bureau of Investigations and refresh some of Ukrainian institutions so that we are more resilient from inside. It's a great message. I fully support it. But nothing was done.
Well, maybe not enough time passed.
Not enough time. He set the deadline in his speech in early January. He said, by end of January, I will introduce to the Parliament of Ukraine a new law on State Bureau of Investigations. It is already March.
Do you think, like right now, because back in the day, so in July, there was street protests to defend the independence of anti-corruption institutions. Also in November, when a bunch of high-ranking officials were implicated in corruption, the whole country was watching this, right? Right now, people shifted their attention to
War in Iran.
war in Ukraine, wars everywhere. So do you think that maybe the government and the president decided, okay, people forgot about this, we can forget about those kind of reforms and just make sure that nothing major happens and we'll survive this?
Yeah, and that entire world is guilty and needs to provide us in something, including fast-track EU accession. And this is what Zelensky keeps saying. We want EU to do something for us. We want the deadline for the EU accession in 2027. And at the same time, nothing was done to rebuild trust with the EU, which was broken last year. When there was attack on Nabo and Sapo.
Do you actually think it's broken? Because we hear...
It is. It is broken.
Okay, because if we're talking about people in Brussels, right, they usually say something off-rec like, yeah, this was not great, but we still have to support Ukraine because obvious reasons, right? And so this is kind of a minor inconvenience in the EU's relationship with Ukraine. I didn't hear any strong-worded statements that now Ukraine has to do something to rebuild trust.
Marta Kos, the commissioner on enlargement, said exactly about trust. The trust was broken. And I think this was trust between Zelensky and EU. It was not trust between the people of Ukraine and the EU and the people of the European Union. The people of Ukraine, in their absolute majority, 85% support EU integration. Moreover, 67% of the people of Ukraine are ready to some inconvenience, even if their lifestyle will be diminishing in exchange for the EU integration. Moreover, if you look how the people of Ukraine assess what is the EU for us, they think that EU is about, first of all, fighting corruption, then about possible prosperity, personal prosperity, and the third is about rule of law. This is the New Europe Center sociology, which was done exactly after the Midas investigation. So it means that the people of Ukraine want not only support from Europe in a form of money, in a form of defense articles. People of Ukraine want EU integration to build justice here, because there is the clear link between the EU accession and building independent law enforcement and judicial institutions.
There's kind of an understanding that it's actually Brussels, together with the people of Ukraine, who are pushing all governments, all previous governments to actually reform, and that governments actually pushed back against reforming the state.
Yes, unfortunately, this is the tradition of every Ukrainian leadership. Even during the wartime, the large-scale invasion, unfortunately, the top leadership, and in our case, it's starting from President Zelensky, are not eager to do this. Complicated for them, but very needed for the people of Ukraine, rule of law reforms. And based on the Midas investigation, we can understand why. Because the inner circle was robbing the state in the middle of the war. It is like earning dirty money at the blood of the people is unacceptable.
We will move to EU accession a bit later. I just want to roll back a bit and go case by case with the high-profile investigations right now. So the Midas investigation that you were talking about, it's circling again around Energoatom, the state energy company, where a lot of high-ranking officials were implicated. Some of them were charged, and also the friend or former business partner of President Zelensky was part of this scheme. He was able to leave the country before he was charged. Right now, he's allegedly in Israel, according to Ukrainian investigations. Do you think that in Ukraine, there's still this perception that a person can be tipped off, leave the country, and he or she will escape justice?
I think that it is true that some of the top, officials with notices of suspicion were able to run away from the country. Yet, recently there was a case against German Halushenko. It's our former Minister of Justice, who was part-time also coordinating our Ministry of Energy. He was part of the Midas organized crime group. So NABU detectives charged him on his way to Poland. He was trying to run away from the country, and the border guards stopped him and brought him back to NABU, and now he is in jail. He says he can't pay bail, which is quite significant, right? But NABU and SAPO charge him for personally laundering about more than $10 million through the chain of complicated shell companies. And part of this money was spent on luxurious education of his children in Switzerland. It's about $250,000 a year to study at school in Switzerland. So this was paid basically from the pockets of the Ukrainian people. And so Halushenko was not able to escape. And one more important detail here is that NABU and SAPO recently also charged the former head of the State Bodyguard Service, Mr. Deineko, for actually covering up corruption in trafficking and smuggling of tobacco. I think that after this guy, former head of the State Bodyguard Service, was fired from his position, there happened to be probably more tools to prevent this large-scale corruption suspect people to run away from the country.
Do you think that Mr. Timur Mindic, who escaped the country, who's the former business partner of President Zelensky, do you think he will somehow be trialed and serve justice?
Israel rarely does extradition, especially of its own citizens. Timur Mindic has both Ukrainian and Israeli citizenship. If Ukraine asks to extradite him, Israel, I don't know, can say yes, can say no. I think that Timur Mindic will do everything possible to prevent from coming here. So publicly he goes and says he's ready to...
Only if he's let out back, right? He said
he will not be in jail, he is ready to come back. I think that he knows a lot, and I think his public messaging is addressing President Zelensky and probably Andriy Yermak. So he wants to send them the signal that if they will not protect him somehow, that he will speak up and reveal probably some other wrongdoings or who was covering up all that corruption schemes.
This major corruption investigation, there's also a few other also big corruption probes. One of them is circling around lawmakers receiving bribes for votes. There's actually two separate cases, right? One is pro-government lawmakers receiving bribes to actually support government decisions, and another one is for lawmakers receiving bribes to not support government decisions. What do you make of this as in Ukraine right now, there's around 47, I think, lawmakers who are under investigation. There's major corruption probes all across parliament. Do you see this as actually Ukraine persecuting corruption and doing its part, or you see this as everyone in parliament being corrupt and parliament is being ineffective?
This is the problem of payments in envelopes given to members of parliament for specific votes. Such a practice existed in Ukraine, unfortunately, in Ukrainian parliament for decades. And finally, we have anti-corruption institutions which are able to charge those who are receiving the envelopes and those who are giving the envelopes. So in the case of the so-called opposition, the head of the Batkivshina political party, famous Yulia Tymoshenko, was charged for giving the envelopes for specific votes or for specific non-votes. And I think this case is very perspective. I compare it with the case against Al Capone in the United States.
Well, that's a big compliment to Yulia Tymoshenko, I think.
But I'm following her political career and also her career as a mastermind of various schemes of money laundering, etc., for about 20 years. And she's genius. I've read about her past money laundering exercises through American courts. One of the former prime ministers of Ukraine, Pavlo Lazarenko, was charged for money laundering in the United States. And if you dig into that case, which has public records, you see where he was receiving money from. He was receiving money from Yulia Tymoshenko. And these were hundreds of millions of dollars. And now Yulia Tymoshenko is charged for $40,000 pocket of money in a small bag, which she prepared to give to other members of parliament as a bribe.
But do you think that this case will be solved and she will be convicted? Because the problem...
I'm quite confident in that. I think that if NABU, SAPO and Anti-Corruption Court will not be destroyed by existing ruling elite, she will be convicted and she will go to jail.
But there's also another kind of viewpoint on this, is that because she's not big enough, she's in the opposition, but she's not really popular, her time passed a bit, that maybe this can be a show trial as showing that Ukraine is actually convicting political heavyweights while actual heavyweights escape justice.
This is the argument from Yulia Tymoshenko. Obviously, she is doing that argument. She is a very professional politician with decades of experience. Yet the trial did happen in the High Anti-Corruption Court, which is probably the most clean court in the country, where if there is no evidence or if there is weak evidence, she will not be convicted. As simple as that. So the actual case is not complicated. NABU has the set of evidence which indicates that she agreed to provide bribe to members of parliament. The actual bribe, the money which was intended to give, were seized, and her phones were seized. I think that from those phones, NABU probably received additional evidence. From the legal perspective, it's a very, very simple case. It's much, much, much harder to investigate this $100 million money laundering in the Midas operation, rather than the provocation, rather than this, intent to give bribe. From the criminal code and criminal procedure perspective, this is completely different.
But the question here is not like, is the case simple or not? It's just the problem, and that's what the heads of anti-corruption institutions told us on multiple occasions, is that they are doing their part, right? And you can see that they are actually doing the work, right? And then cases die in courts, right? Because courts are unreformed, and even the High Anti-Corruption Court, which is brand new, I think it's 10 years old, a bit less, right? But it's still is really slow. There's cases like a case with Mr. Nasirov, who is the former head of customs, I think, who's been on trial for years now, right? So nothing is moving, and those cases die in courts, and that's why a lot of the people think that, okay, Ukraine is corrupt, is unreformed, because they actually don't see convictions. So, and the Tymoshenko case, right, it's kind of a clear indicator, can Ukraine actually prosecute corruption, because it's such an easy case to solve.
That's true. Cases usually delay in the High Anti-Corruption Court. And some of the reasons are just because judges are allowing the delays, but some of the reasons lie in the criminal procedure code, and there are ways and tools how professional attorneys can simply manipulate with their rights and delay the procedure for years. Also, there are some nuances and technical laws in the technical norms in the criminal procedure code, which have to be fixed. It is even in the EU 10 points, and we can talk about these 10 points. Number 1 and number 2, to strengthen NABU and SAPO. So, strengthening them, we have to have these technical clauses into the criminal procedure code, which prevent delays and empowers NABU and SAPO and High Anti-Corruption Court to hear these cases much faster. We don't see the draft law in the parliament. So the government, particularly our Vice Prime Minister of European integration, promised that we're going to do that in 2026. Our Prime Minister, Yulia Sviridenko, was making big PR of talking to NABU and European ambassadors, saying, okay, we see that we have to strengthen our anti-corruption institutions. We are talking to them. We are collecting proposals. We will introduce them to the parliament. Nothing was introduced. So these things can be fixed. They should be fixed. We have promised to the EU to fix them, to rebuild trust. Nothing is done. We don't even have the one person in government, in parliament, in entire our political landscape who would be actually in charge of all this rule of law and judicial reforms.
Well, Mr. Tatarov, I would say.
Yeah.
A quick remark, Mr. Tatarov is deputy head of the president's office, who is in charge of overseeing the judiciary, I would say, and law enforcement agencies in Ukraine.
But de facto, indeed, we don't have Minister of Justice. I would like to remember Mr. Halushenko, one of the most recent big fishes caught by NABU, used to be Minister of Justice. And Parliament, President, they didn't find the person who could replace him. He didn't finish with envelopes.
Okay.
It is not only Yulia Tymoshenko. These were members of Parliament from Servant of the People who received bribes and received envelopes who were charged.
But here it's actually really interesting, because in the Tymoshenko case, right, the perpetrator, Tymoshenko, was basically caught red-handed, right? With the Servant of the People party, the pro-government party, the lawmakers were charged, but nobody's saying who actually gives them the money for their votes.
Nobody is saying in official charges, but everyone in the political landscape knows who was that.
And who was that?
David Arahamia, the head of the faction, basically.
Why do you think, if, as you're saying, everybody knows who is doing it, why this person is not charged?
Because Prosecutor General is the one who can allow NABU and SAPO to charge any member of parliament. NABU and SAPO cannot even register a case against member of parliament without direct blessing of Prosecutor General. And Ruslan Kravchenko is not given this blessing. I'm more than convinced in that. I am convinced that that's the reason why Ruslan Kravchenko is still in his position of Prosecutor General. If you recall, he was the one who first supporting the law on destroying NABU and SAPO. And second, he was personally charging NABU detectives like Ruslan Magomed Rasulov for investigating Midas. But he was saying that it's kind of Russian influences. I'm investigating Russian influences. He personally charged this detective and threw him to the jail for 5 months for under fabricated case. Still, he's in the office. It's a very important position in the country. Prosecutor General has enormous powers. Prosecutors, apart from SAPO, which have some guarantees of independence, are very hierarchical structure. So Ruslan Kravchenko can be fired by members of parliament. They, under Constitution, have right to sign signatures, and it's
But do you even think we
non-confidence
have
vote.
a functioning parliament at this point?
They can vote. They have voted for the budget. They have voted for increase of salaries for themselves. They don't need envelopes, by the way, anymore. I agree that members of parliaments need to have decent salary. In the law on budget, they have increased payments to them. It's 200,000 hryvnias per each. It's significant for Ukraine. It's about $4,000, even 5. And they can do their job, serving the people of Ukraine, not serving themselves and their
But
interests.
it's not a secret that over the past, I would say, 2-ish years, getting lawmakers into the same room in parliament and having them vote on something is a struggle, right? And with Mr. Arkhame, who you mentioned, his kind of unofficial role was actually securing the number of votes needed, right? And right now he moved to the negotiations with the Americans, and so there's kind of rumors on the streets that the parliament is actually inactive and Ukraine doesn't have a functioning parliament.
These are the rumors spread by the government of Ukraine and by Office of President of Ukraine. This is the argument which they are trying to sell to our European allies, first of all to Brussels, to explain why they are not doing all these rule of law reforms. My counter-argument to that is, okay, if the parliament cannot vote, we will deal with that. The Ukrainian people will deal with parliament. But could you please just introduce the law in the parliament? We can start from president. They say parliament is not voting, but why wouldn't you start at least doing your part, introducing that to the parliament, and then the people of Ukraine will deal with the parliament? Because the people
This
of
sounds
Ukraine...
like a threat.
Well, it sounds like democracy. A parliament is reporting to the people of Ukraine, to the voters. An absolute majority of Ukrainians, 85%, support EU integration. So if government introduces, let's say, 10 laws saying, you see, these 10 laws are reflecting 10 points which EU wants us to do, this restores trust, this will bring Ukraine to EU in 27 or 2028, you see? And these MPs don't vote for them. That's one story. Then the voters who actually voted for these people, their family members, their neighbors, they will impose pressure on members of parliament.
But you're talking about that the president has to introduce those laws. But there's lawmakers who can introduce those laws. So nobody's doing their part.
Listen, lawmakers, majority, servant of the people. This is the presidential faction. Lawmakers approved the parliament, approved the government. It's not a secret that the largest power in the country, in de facto, unfortunately, have not the lawmakers, but the president of Ukraine, President Zelensky. He brought this parliament through elections with his promises to deliver justice and fight corruption. So if the parliament is not working, okay, it's by the way, your parliament. And do your job. Introduce laws which you have promised, which will bring us to the EU. But I'm not sure whether President Zelensky sincerely wants to bring us to the EU. Honestly, I doubt that. If he was firing people like Oleg Tatarov, Prosecutor General Kravchenko, rebooting State Bureau of Investigations, for me, it would have been the signal that he indeed learned on his mistakes, that the attack on Nabon Sapo was a mistake, that his former business partners like Mindic robbing the country, it was a horrible mistake, and that he's finally changing the way how he is selecting people into important senior positions and how is he treating justice. But he didn't do that.
There's also kind of an argument, I would say, that Mr. Arachamia, who's the head of the Servant of the People faction in parliament, and Mr. Umerov, who's the head of the, secretary of the National Security and Defense Council, Mr. Umerov was mentioned in the court hearings around this Mindas investigation, which deals with the Energoatom company, that those two people are not charged because they're part of the current negotiations with the Americans. And there is kind of a fear that if anti-corruption institutions start charging people who are currently the face of Ukraine dealing with Americans or Russians, that would kind of play into the Russian hands or American hands.
Russia will always play the card of Ukraine, the most corrupt country in the world. It will play whether we have anti-corruption investigations or whether we don't have anti-corruption investigations. I believe that we are stronger if we say, of course there is corruption in Ukraine, of course. But we have built, since Revolution of Dignity, anti-corruption bodies which are able to punish for large-scale corruption. There is corruption in America, there is corruption in Europe. What do you guys do with that? We are serious about that. We have electronic system of asset declarations, one of the most comprehensive in the world, and we have this comprehensive infrastructure for anti-corruption bodies. And it is important to do one more step. Now we have the island of integrity, these tiny boutique anti-corruption bodies. NABU, SAPO, High Anti-Corruption Court, they're little. It's about 40 anti-corruption prosecutors. And NABU in total is up to 2,000 people. It's little. High Anti-Corruption Court, 50 or something like that. Compared to Prosecutor General, with more than 10,000 people, compared to State Bureau of Investigations, to National Police, State Bureau Security Service, hundreds of thousands of people. And we have to take lessons learned and what works in these boutique law enforcement and judicial structures and expand them to all our law enforcement and judiciary. That sounds like easy, but that's what will really make Ukrainian much more resilient from inside. We've been kind of promoted as very resilient. Ukraine has a very resilient society, very, very resilient people, but institutions are weak. And Russia has been using our weak institutions through strategic corruption to destroy us from inside.
That kind of brings me to the next point. We were briefly mentioning EU integration. So right now, the current strategy that the Ukrainian government has is that we want to add a point of Ukraine joining the European Union into a peace settlement with Russia. So basically, President first said that it should be 2027. Then he kind of moved it to 2028. So there's this kind of notion that because Ukraine is fighting for Europe as well, that having Ukraine in the European Union should be part of this negotiation. But on the other hand, usually the accession talks are tied to reforms in the country, rule of law, judicial reforms, and so on. And so Ukraine is kind of having a point that Ukraine should be part of the European Union because we're also helping the European Union, but we are kind of skipping the whole accession procedure. What do you make of this? And do you see this as maybe kind of an attempt to stall the reforms and just have this EU accession as a political decision?
EU accession is impossible without doing the basic reforms. It's just how the EU is designed. And if you look who is making the final decision about the EU accession is every single member state. It's not Brussels. And in some of the countries, if I recall well, France and the Netherlands, the referendums, the people have to support accession of the third one more country to the EU. We need to have very powerful arguments which we can use in order to explain to the people of the EU why Ukraine is not a problem, why Ukraine is a solution, why Ukraine is strengthening EU, why Ukraine will not be just another Hungary with another Orban, just behaving as a Russian puppet or someone else puppet, and destroying institutions, not supporting all the decisions. And the only way to convince the people in the European Union is to say, listen, yes, we have corruption. Look how much we have done. All these reforms, rule of law, roadmap, which we have agreed, we have fully implemented. And you see, this is the European Commission, independent experts explaining that and supporting that. And I would like, as an anti-corruption activist, not to stay here in Ukraine, but to go travel all across Europe and explain to the people there that, listen, as a watchdog organization from Ukraine, I guarantee you that we've done everything to minimize corruption and to prevent Ukraine from becoming another Hungary inside Europe.
How do we balance the fact that obviously Ukrainians are fighting a war for democracy, for European values, and Ukrainians deserve the right to be in the European Union, with also the process that, okay, Ukraine still needs to do reforms and so on. So it's a hard sell where a European official would, for example, come to Kyiv and say, yes, you're dying, but you also need to reform the courts, right? It's kind of a really hard equation here.
It's hard equation for Zelensky, but it's not hard equation for the people of Ukraine. Ukrainians are not dying for Belarus. Ukrainians are dying for Ukraine where there is dignity, rule of law, justice. They are not dying for Mindich to be able to steal $100 million per year in critical energy infrastructure. Ukrainians are not dying for some hidden interest to steal in our defense sector. Ukrainians are dying for having decent life and dignity and justice. And this is what Ukrainians associate the EU integration with. That's as simple as that. And the main mistake for our international partners is to equal Zelensky with the people of Ukraine. Not necessarily the interests of Zelensky are the same as the interests of the people of Ukraine. The people of Ukraine clearly indicate what we want. It is clearly written in sociology. We want these reforms.
Thank you for watching our interview with Daria Kaleniuk, one of Ukraine's best-known anti-corruption activists. If you want more interviews like this, if you want to support our work, please become a member of the Kyiv Independent. To not miss out interviews like this and all of our other projects, such as field reports, such as explainers, and our weekly show, please subscribe to our YouTube channel. Thank you for your support.